Ah, the Black Plague. We are stepping into the darkest days of history, dear listeners. Imagine dark clouds gathering on the horizon and the world is in the grip of such a catastrophe that millions of people are crushed under its dark shadow. A death storm spreading from the narrow streets of the Middle Ages. A disease that ravaged not only Europe, but the whole world, the Black Plague. This disease was a catastrophe so great, so powerful, that it changed the course of European history. It shook empires, emptied cities, and left kings helpless. The Black Plague uprooted not only people but also the building blocks of societies. Economies were collapsing, agriculture was at a standstill, and people were begging God for help. But there was a truth hidden behind this great catastrophe. This plague changed the course of human history. A renaissance would emerge from the darkness of the Middle Ages. But until then, death was around every corner. Europe, Asia, Africa. All were affected by the speed with which this disease spread. Today I will tell you the dark story of the Black Plague. You will learn how people fell prey to this ruthless disease, how the world succumbed to this catastrophe, and how this plague reshaped human history. If you are ready, step by step, we are going to take a journey into the depths of this dark period. Ah, the Black Plague. Welcome to that dark, cold period of human history. A time when time stood still, when death came silently to every doorstep, when people lost hope. A catastrophe that turned cities into ghost towns, brought empires to their knees, brought even kings to their knees. The dark shadow of the Black Plague cast a nightmarish shadow over Europe, Asia, and even North Africa. The world had never seen such devastation. Imagine, dear listeners, death before your eyes, destruction on every street corner. Trade routes empty, city squares deserted. Only the silence of death echoes through the once bustling streets of the city. Churches, once overflowing with people, now collapse in silent prayer. Some seek refuge in God, others walk a thin line between life and death. But the Black my friends, the Black Plague was not just a disease. It was a turning point in the destiny of mankind. It brought destruction not only physically, but also socially, economically, and culturally. As the old world collapsed, it paved the way for the birth of a new one. This catastrophe at the heart of Europe eventually led to the end of the Middle Ages and the birth of the Renaissance. Understanding this turning point is not just about seeing the effects of the disease. It is necessary to see the desperate resistance of people, the reshaping of societies, and how the course of history changed. The Black Plague is perhaps one of the most tragic, but also one of the most striking events in human history. Every moment, every detail is full of traces of a catastrophe that is deeply embedded in our history. So, dear listeners, on our journey today, we will explore in detail the devastation wrought by the Black Plague. We will learn together how it came, what it destroyed, and what kind of world it shaped. We are about to turn the darkest pages of history. Are you ready? Then let's follow in the footsteps of this great destruction. Getting to the roots of the Black Plague is like understanding how a seed of death was sown into the world. The story of this terrible plague begins in the mysterious lands of distant lands. Deep in the depths of Far Asia, and the vast steppe is inhabited by nomadic peoples, a storm of death was born. Spreading from the borders of China to the endless steppes of Central Asia, it grew and flourished, following the rhythm of trade routes. Those roads, the Silk Road, where merchants carried their goods, where different cultures and ideas met, became a road of death. As cities collapsed one by one, desperate people fled in panic, hoping to escape the plague. The Silk Road, that vital artery through which trade, cultures and ideas had flowed between civilizations for centuries, had now become the corridor of death. Those roads where traders carried gold and spices now carried the dark shadow of death. As this terrible disease, which started in China, spread deeper into Central Asia, cities began to fall one by one. And this deadly epidemic was a harbinger of not only physical but also spiritual collapse. People were now dying not only from the plague, but also from fear and despair. As this wave of despair moved westward, the world would be plunged into a new chaos. The Black Plague spread rapidly across Central Asia, wreaking havoc across the vast lands of the Mongol Empire. Mongol caravans were one of the most important vehicles carrying the plague on trade routes. As fast and ruthless as the invasions of the Mongol soldiers, this disease reached every corner and left every house in ruins. Even Mongol leaders were brought to their knees by the devastation of this plague. Sometimes history finds a way to subjugate even the most powerful, and this was the way the plague had chosen. Spreading from the Mongol Empire, the deadly disease first reached Crimea and the Black Sea coast. The Tatars began to use the plague as a weapon of war. During the siege of Kiev, The corpses of Tatar soldiers who died of the disease were catapulted into the city walls. Here, my dear friends, is one of the first examples of biological warfare in history. This time death became a tactic of war, and this destructive tactic paved the way for the plague to spread to Europe. The plague was carried It spread from at that some but in And so the Black Plague became one of the greatest tragedies in world history. Carried along the Silk Road, this deadly disease spread from Asia to Europe, transforming the lives of both East and West. The world would never be the same again. The year 1347. That year, that ominous period of time when the fate of Europe changed forever. Europe had seen many invasions, wars, and devastation in its history, but never anything so sudden, so cruel, and so sweeping. On this date, ships from far and wide brought disaster to Europe's doorstep. These death ships carried perhaps one of the greatest tragedies in human history, the Black Plague. The story begins on the warm Sicilian coast. This land had seen many invaders before: Arabs, Normans, Byzantines. But now there was no army, no weapons this time. The enemy was invisible and had landed with his silent cargo on the ships. When the plague came to Sicily in 1347, no one recognized it. No one anticipated the wave of terror it brought. The Genoese ships had sailed from the Black Sea port of Cathay, the epicenter of that ominous disease. They carried the deadly plague from the depths of the Black Sea to the warm waters of the Mediterranean. Genoese merchants used to carry trade goods all over Europe: silks, spices, exotic goods. But this time, the ships carried not only goods, but death, and that death spread everywhere. By the time the ships docked in the Sicilian harbor, the disease had already infected the bodies of the merchants and sailors. Not only the goods, but also the people who set foot on land were carriers of the disease. Everyone who met them in the harbor was stepping into the dark shadow of death, perhaps without even realizing it. In those days, dear listeners, people did not know how the disease spread. But we know that it was a plague bacterium transmitted to humans by fleas. Rats on ships silently carried plague fleas to the ports. As people boarded these ships to trade, to unload their goods, they were unaware of the disease. And this is how death arrived in Europe. The spread of the disease in Sicily soon spread like wildfire across the continent. But it was these Genoese ships that started it all. The Genoese were carrying the goods they bought from the Black Sea to Europe. maintaining the vitality of trade. Unfortunately, this time it was not wealth they were carrying, but disease. The tragedy that started in the port of Kefe had traveled by ship to the heart of Europe. Imagine, my dear friends, that in just a few months this invisible enemy, brought to Sicily by Genoese merchants, began to spread across the continent. From one port to another, from one city to another, the plague spread rapidly. The horror that had started in Sicily spread across the Italian peninsula. Merchants, families, dock workers, priests, soldiers. Everyone fell prey to the disease. Once the disease spread, it was unstoppable. People were desperate, trying to live without knowing which door death awaited them. By the end of 1347, it was no longer just Sicily, but all of Italy and the surrounding port cities were under the influence of the plague. The plague devastated the lives of the people living in these cities. In every street, in every house, in every square, the horror of the disease could be felt. The victims of the plague began to multiply at an alarming rate. After Sicily, this deadly disease soon spread across the European continent. Genoese merchants became the main carriers of this devastating epidemic, perhaps without even realizing it. Ah, the Genoese. This powerful city-state, which controlled the trade routes not only of the Mediterranean but of the whole of Europe, had now unintentionally become the messengers of death. And this story didn't just end in the Sicilian harbor. Like a rapidly growing storm, the plague spread to every corner of Europe. It crossed trade routes, seas, and mountains. The Black Plague had captured the heart of Europe, and there was no turning back. This greatest catastrophe in the history of mankind would radically change the socio-economic and cultural structure of a continent. Yes, dear friends, this is how the story of the Black Plague's first entry into Sicily and Europe began. Leaving only death and destruction in its wake, this terrible epidemic began to spread to every corner of Europe. The Genoese ships docking in Sicilian ports opened the doors not only to a catastrophe, but to a tragedy that changed the course of history. This Black Death descended upon Europe and began a process that would change the fate of the continent forever. Ah, my dear friends, now we will continue to tell the story of how the Black Death spread rapidly once it set foot on European soil and the devastation that shook the entire continent. Spreading from the ports of Sicily, the plague quickly spread like a hurricane across Italy and then across southern Europe. But this hurricane swept through everything, whether it was a city or a country. The warm southern coast of Europe was about to experience the greatest disaster in its history. Towards the end of 1347, the plague swept across Sicily and headed north into the great cities of Italy. During the Middle Ages, Italy was home to some of the richest and most vibrant cities in Europe. Venice, Florence, Milan, and Rome. These cities were centers of art, trade, and civilization. But when the plague came, neither wealth nor civilization was enough to stop it. The deadly disease spread like a fog. No one could understand how its spread people would suddenly collapse in the streets and die within days. Especially Venice. Ah, this magnificent water city was the heart of trade. Soon after the Genoese ships, the plague reached here too. The city's harbors were overflowing with trade goods, but every ship that docked brought death with it. In desperation, the people of Venice tried to make sense of this new catastrophe. The wealth that had flowed into the city through the trade routes had now become the prime mover of disaster. People did not know what to do. City squares emptied, houses fell silent. Rich or poor, the plague did not discriminate. The devastation that started in Venice quickly spread to other cities in Italy. Florence. Ah, Florence. This city, the birthplace of the Renaissance, the center of art and literature, soon fell into the clutches of the plague. Every day people saw hundreds and thousands of dead bodies. Even funerals could no longer be organized. Houses and streets were littered with corpses. Even priests, doctors, and nobles could not escape the grip of the disease. Dante's city had become a land of death. The streets were empty. Only the cold breath of death could be felt. But the plague did not only hit northern Italy. It spread rapidly across southern Europe. By 1348, the plague had spread from the Mediterranean coast to Spain and even to the south of France. The cities of southern Europe, like their Italian brethren, were helpless in the face of the horrors of this disease. In Spain, especially the major port cities of Barcelona, Valencia, and Seville felt the impact of the plague deeply. Just like the ports in Sicily and Italy, the disease, brought by Genoese and other merchants, soon spread everywhere. In France, Mediterranean ports such as Marseille and Nice were the first to be hit. Especially Marseille, being the center of maritime trade, was one of the first and strongest hit by the plague. Quarantines to prevent the spread of the disease, the closing of city gates, the desperate attempts of the people to flee the city. None of it worked. People did not know what to do in the face of this invisible enemy. The plague listened to neither churches, nor kings, nor strong rulers. It devoured everyone and everything. In southern Europe, the plague spread like wildfire. No city, no village could escape its wrath. People began to believe that this disaster was God's punishment, because what other explanation could there be? People prayed, churches held penitential services until the morning. But neither prayer nor faith was enough to stop this catastrophe. Even priests fell victim to the plague. Churches were filled with the stench of death. The tragedy of southern Europe was not limited to the loss of life. Economic life almost collapsed as well. Agriculture ground to a halt because there was no one left to work in the fields. Merchants were leaving their cities, peasants were leaving their homes and farms. The whole structure of society began to crumble. The lively, crowded markets of southern Europe fell silent. Cities emptied one by one. People began to think that death was inevitable. The plague had completely changed people's daily lives, making despair and fear prevail. Yes, dear listeners, this Black Death caused such devastation in Italy and southern Europe. The plague destroyed not only people's lives, but also the entire social and economic structure of Europe. Cities fell silent, and people prepared to face death at any moment. The Black Plague was sweeping away everyone, rich and poor, peasant and noble. And the end of this catastrophe was not yet in sight. Ah, my dear listeners, I will now take you on the cold, bleak journey northward of the Black Plague. As the catastrophe began on the warm shores of the Mediterranean and slowly made its way into the heart of Europe, the shadow of death crept northward without pause. From Italy to France, then to the verdant valleys of England, and finally to the icy lands of Scandinavia, the black disease left only destruction and fear wherever it went. As northern Europe fell into the grip of the Black Death, history once again revealed the helplessness of humanity. By the time it reached France, the plague had already begun to engulf the great cities of Europe. Paris, with its huge crowds, heard the whispers of death in its streets. In 1348, the plague spread rapidly along the Seine River. The scene in the city was not so different from what we see in Rome or Venice. The narrow streets of Paris, the stone houses, the great churches, all these were facing death. People were losing loved ones with nothing they could do. Priests were praying for days. But neither those prayers nor the candles lit in the churches were enough to stop the disease. The Black Plague deepened the fearful silence that echoed in the hearts of great cities like Paris. The city streets began to empty, and the survivors tried to leave the city in desperation. But the effort was futile. The plague was on their heels. And then, dear listeners, that terrible disaster reached England. In 1348, ships docked at trading ports on the south coast, and the disease entered England. The ports of Southampton and Bristol, in particular, became the gateway for the plague to enter England. The ships brought not only trade goods, but also the seeds of the Black Death. Some of the sailors carried the disease without even realizing it. With these sailors, the plague spread rapidly across the island. London, the glorious capital of England, turned into a killing field. The crowded nature of the city further accelerated the spread of the disease. Day by day, the death rate increased. People could not even carry the bodies of the dead through the narrow streets of London. The plague did not only hit cities. Death was also said to be rampant in rural England. In small villages, people were unable to look each other in the face for several days. Everyone was terrified no one could find a way to stop the disease. From London to Edinburgh, the plague spread to every corner of northern Europe. One by one, England's cities and towns began to collapse before the eyes of the people. Chronicles of the time record that even in rural areas, mortality rates rose to incredible levels. Some villages emptied completely, and even the names of settlements that lost their entire population were erased from history. Old and young, women and children. No one escaped this Black Death. But the relentless march of death was not yet over. It went north, further north, all the way to Scandinavia. In 1349, a ship docked on the cold coast of Norway. The port of Bergen became the gateway for this black disease to enter the Scandinavian lands. These harsh lands of the north had been used to wars, cold and hunger for years. But now they faced an enemy they had never seen before the plague. Even the descendants of the Vikings who struggled with those harsh winds were left defenseless against this invisible enemy. Starting in Norway and spreading through Denmark, Sweden and Finland, the plague devastated Scandinavian villages. Most of the population had to face another catastrophe during the cold winter days. Agriculture came to a standstill because there was no one left to work in the fields. Many villages were completely emptied and abandoned. Historians write that the death rate in Scandinavia at that time reached up to 1/3 of the population. Imagine, dear listeners, more than half of the inhabitants of a village dying within a few weeks. It was a devastation that destroyed not only bodies but also communities. The effects of the plague in the cold north profoundly changed not only the cities, but also the culture and social structure of that region. Even in Norse mythology, this period revived legends about the gods of death and epidemics. Societies embraced different beliefs to make sense of this pandemic. In a world where death knocked at every door, people seemed resigned to their fate. No matter what class, no matter what lineage, anyone could fall victim to this ruthless disease. And so, dear listeners, the plague spread to the icy lands of Scandinavia, not only on the warm Mediterranean coast, but also in the cold north. Neither kings, nor peasants, nor warriors could escape this invisible enemy. The Black Plague continued to leave its mark in every corner of Europe, shaking every society. But this terrible journey was not yet over. The plague would travel deeper and farther. Ah, my dear friends, the Black Death didn't just leave a deep wound on bodies, it cut to the very roots of society. Yes, as the plague ravaged Europe, it wasn't just cities and towns that vanished, but the long-standing social order of Europe was shattered. Those who remained after that great devastation had to pick up the pieces once more. But it was anything but easy. The plague shook not just lives, but the very foundations of Europe's economic and social structure. The loss of a significant portion of the population created a domino effect, turning everything upside down. First, dear listeners, you should know that the plague was so merciless that in just a few years it claimed nearly 1/3 of Europe's population. This meant burying hundreds of thousands, even millions, of people. So what impact did such a massive loss of life have on those who remained? With most of the workers who tended the fields dead, the lands lay barren and crops went unharvested. Villages fell silent. The vast estates of the feudal lords became desolate and unproductive, as there were no workers left to farm them. As peasants buried the bodies of their relatives on their lands, They continued their struggle for survival. With not enough people to work, agricultural production plummeted. Hunger and poverty spread rapidly. The feudal system, the backbone of Europe's social order, began to shake at its roots. As you know, feudal lords depended on the labor of peasants for the productivity of their lands. However, when a large portion of the peasants fell victim to the plague, finding a workforce became nearly impossible. The surviving workers became more valuable, which increased their bargaining power. The feudal lords had no choice but to grant more rights to the peasants in order to find laborers. This labor shortage drove up wages for workers. This was something previously unimaginable. Peasants, who had lived tied to their lands for centuries, were now freer after the plague and could demand better living conditions. This labor crisis and the collapse of agricultural production naturally created chaos in the economic system. Trade nearly came to a standstill. As artisans, merchants, and peasants struggled with death in the cities, the wheels of the economy ground to a halt. Once overflowing with gold and silver, Europe's major trade routes now bore the marks of death and emptiness. The luxurious goods brought from the east along the Silk Road no longer attracted the same demand. There were no buyers left, or the wealthy chasing those luxury items had already become one with the earth. Merchants began fleeing the city's trade networks shrank, and major ports fell silent. While Europe wrestled with death, it also had to figure out how to rise from this economic collapse. But dear listeners, the real upheavals didn't stop there. A significant unrest emerged among the lowest strata of society, among the peasants. The surviving workers began demanding more rights and better conditions. Meanwhile, the feudal lords still wanted to maintain the old order. This struggle between the two forces led to major revolts. In England, the Peasants' Revolt erupted in 1381. The peasants demanded better wages, freedoms, and recognition of their rights to land. But this revolt wasn't limited to England. In many parts of Europe, peasants and the lower classes could no longer tolerate being oppressed under the feudal lords and rose up. The Jacquerie Revolt in France and peasant uprisings in Germany followed one after the other. The labor shortage had made the peasants feel stronger, and they began to demand the respect they deserved. And these uprisings, dear listeners, were not merely a result of the labor shortage. The Black Death exposed the injustices, brutalities, and inequalities rooted in society. The sudden and massive wave of death, brought on by the disease, struck every class in Europe, from the richest to the poorest equally. The plague killed nobles just as it did peasants. This led to a significant intellectual shift among the people. They began to realize how fragile life was and how insignificant social classes could be in the face of a disease. Over time, the feudal lords started to lose their power. Those grand castles were no longer as strong as they once were. The revolts and demands of the peasants not only deeply affected local order, but also the overall social structure of Europe. The feudal system weakened the people fought for better living conditions, and this process would herald major societal changes in Europe in the future. The Black Death sparked a awakening among the lower classes of society as revolts and social movements began to shake the dark order of the Middle Ages. Dear listeners, thus we see that the Black Death was not only a force that destroyed bodies but also societies, lands, agricultural production, labor, and social order. All were torn apart by this invisible enemy. However, after this great destruction, a new Europe would begin to take shape. The crumbling of feudalism and the rising voices of the lower classes signaled that an era was coming to an end and a new age was approaching. Ah, my dear friends, the Black Death was such a merciless storm that the people of that time didn't know what to do. Death loomed at their doorsteps, sweeping through cities like a tidal wave. So what did people do in the face of this uncertainty? Let me take you through the medical practices of that era and the desperate measures people took during those painful days. Oh, medicine. If only you knew how primitive and helpless it was back then. Medieval doctors didn't really understand what caused disease. Faced with the spread of illness, physicians tried every possible method to develop different treatments. Now, you might be wondering, what did they think needed to be done to treat an illness? The first thing those doctors focused on was correcting the imbalances in the body. Medicine during the Middle Ages was based on Hippocrates and Galen's theory of the four humours. According to this theory, the human body contained four essential fluids: blood, flame, yellow bile, and black bile, and imbalances in these fluids were thought to cause diseases. That's why, when the plague struck, doctors tried to cleanse the blood to treat the illness. They believed that bleeding would help remove the diseased blood from the body. Dear listeners, patients had cuts made on their arms or legs to let the blood flow out. However, this method often worsened patients' conditions as bodies already weakened by the plague became even more frail. But what else could they do? They had no other options. In their desperation, they tried everything. Of course, medicine back then wasn't limited to just bloodletting. Quarantine was one of the most important measures put in place during those days. People understood that the disease was contagious but couldn't figure out how it spread. So the sick were isolated away from cities, and infected individuals were locked in their homes. Although quarantine seemed successful at first, it didn't stop the rapid spread of the disease. This was because the rats that carried the plague and the fleas on them unknowingly spread the illness far and wide. Ships reaching port towns carried the plague from city to city, while people shut themselves in their homes in despair, praying for relief. Yes, my friends, people prayed to the gods, and churches overflowed with worshipers, because many saw this great catastrophe as divine punishment. They believed the plague was the wrath of the gods. And here we have that infamous image. Doctors wearing black cloaks and long bird-like masks. Those bird masks were both frightening and ironic. Medieval doctors filled the masks with aromatic herbs and incense because they believed that bad smells spread disease. Yes, my friends, back then, they thought that foul odors carried through the air were the main source of illness. That's why doctors donned those long beaked masks to block out the bad smells. They would examine patients without touching them, walking through quarantined areas with their sticks. But behind those masks, you could see how helpless they truly were. The disease was too powerful to be stopped with plants or masks. Alongside these desperate medical efforts, many people turned to religious explanations. Churches were packed, and people lined up at church doors to confess their sins. Those who believed that such a massive catastrophe could only be divine punishment rushed to the priests, hoping for forgiveness through their prayers. During this time, many devout individuals believed that God sent the plague to purify humanity of sin. They thought it was a test, with God inflicting suffering to cleanse them. Therefore, some sects believed they could earn God's forgiveness by harming their own bodies. Members of these sects, whipping themselves, proclaimed that there was no escape from God's wrath in a sinful world. But my friends, the plague didn't relent in the face of such religious efforts either. The helplessness of both medicine and religion left a profound impact on people of that time. Some sought refuge in the mountains and forests to escape the wrath of the gods. Others clung to unscientific remedies. The plague was such an overwhelming uncertainty that people didn't know where to turn. Both medicine and religion were helpless against the cruel grip of the plague. Despite their best efforts, the doctors of the Middle Ages couldn't stop this massive outbreak. But my friends, there is always a glimmer of hope behind every despair. And so, the Black Death sowed the seeds of a great transformation in science and medicine. But nobody could see that at the time. Dear listeners, in such a time, people floundered in the helplessness of medicine, and the wrath of the gods, not knowing what to do. The Black Death tested not just lives, but also people's beliefs, hopes, and helplessness. But like everything else, this too would come to an end one day. Ah, my dear friends, while the plague ravaged the earth, it didn't just attack bodies, it put souls through a deep test. People started to believe that such a massive catastrophe must be the will of the gods or a single god. After all, what other explanation could there be for such a devastating event? During that time, the church was the people's biggest refuge, seen as God's representative on earth. When people found themselves in utter despair, they turned to the church, kneeling before priests and bishops. They wanted to understand the true cause of the plague and find some meaning in it. Were you looking to understand if this ruthless epidemic was a punishment? The church had the answer for you, yes. The plague was a punishment. It was the wrath of God. According to the church's teachings back then, people had committed grave sins, and without atoning for these sins, there was no way to escape this horrific disaster. In sermons held in churches, priests claimed that the plague was a warning sent by God, a chance for purification. In a time when sinfulness was on the rise and corruption was rampant, the plague was seen as a sign of God's anger. God wants to cleanse his servants of their sins, they would say, and the people believed these words. After all, what else could they hold on to? Some confessed their sins in the streets, praying for forgiveness from God. Ceremonies, prayers, and rituals in churches started to happen more frequently than ever before. They believed that if they prayed enough and showed their loyalty to God, they could awaken from this dark nightmare. However, dear friends, not everyone was satisfied with the church's harsh stance. Some couldn't settle for just praying. Certain pious groups that emerged during that time chose a much harsher path to demonstrate their loyalty and repentance to God. And that's where the flagellant movement came in. These people sought to show their devotion to God by punishing themselves. The members of the group would whip their bodies with the lashes they held, believing that through their pain, they were cleansing themselves of their sins. Each lash was a step further away from their sins, and they hoped it would earn them God's mercy. These self-punishing rituals began to spread across Europe. Crowds gathered in town squares to watch as these groups whipped their bodies, trying to find meaning in their suffering. Who knows, perhaps these people were paying for their own sins too. My friends, the flagellant movements were both a terrifying and tragic sight. These people, living in pain and sorrow, were ready to make any sacrifice to win God's mercy. Many were nearing death under the lash of the whip, their bodies unable to withstand such a harsh trial. But no matter how hard they tried or how much they suffered, the plague's destructive advance didn't stop. The public's participation in these movements caught the church's attention. The flagellants had begun to gain enough power to shake the church's authority. Some church leaders claimed that these self-flagellating groups were committing an even greater sin against God. Eventually, the church became uncomfortable with these movements. In fact, the church tried to stop them by declaring such practices as heresy. After all, any movement that developed outside the church's control was perceived as a potential threat. Dear listeners, the plague had deeply wounded not just bodies but souls as well. People searched for a divine reason behind this horrific disaster, clinging to their faith in hopes of finding a way out. The church had been both a guide and a source of hope during this process. However much they prayed or however many self-punishing people gathered in the squares, no force could stand against the Black Death. Was it a divine punishment? Maybe. But friends, this epidemic offered humanity not just physical trials but spiritual ones as well. God's silence was pulling people into a profound emptiness. The church's prayers, rituals, and sermons couldn't halt the advance of this terrible disease. Yet humanity learned a great deal from this dreadful test. Faith left deep marks on the minds and hearts of society. As the voices of the flagellants mingled with the church bells, the storm of the Black Death shook the church and the world of faith to its core. My dear friends, as the Black Death spread its deadly grip across Europe, people began desperately searching for the cause of this disaster. Back then, scientific knowledge was limited, and the underdeveloped state of medicine pushed the population deeper into the clutches of superstitions. While we now understand the causes of the plague, things were entirely different back then. When the origin of the disease couldn't be grasped, seeking someone to blame was a ruthless reflex of human nature. And so eyes turned towards the Jewish communities in many parts of Europe. Jewish communities had lived alongside others in many regions for centuries. However, social and religious differences always left them vulnerable to exclusion. The Black Death only fueled this exclusion further. Slowly, whispers began to circulate, claiming the Jews spread this disease on purpose. Some accused the Jews of poisoning water wells in an effort to wipe out Christians. Such baseless accusations ignited anti-Semitic movements and horrific persecutions. Friends, just think about it. In those days when the enemy was invisible, and no one knew when or where the disease would strike, people clung to these rumors with desperation. Jews became targets of great hatred, especially in regions where they were in the minority. In many places, Jewish neighborhoods were attacked, families were forcibly removed from their homes, and executions began. This process escalated to such brutality that in some cities, nearly the entire Jewish population was killed or forced to convert. It's not hard to see that we were facing one of the clearest examples of humanity's dark side. Anti-Jewish movements stretched from northern Spain deep into Germany and were organized in many parts of Europe. Entire Jewish neighborhoods were turned into ruins and families were torn apart. The saddest part was that all this violence was aimed at innocent people simply because of their religious beliefs. While church officials and some kings tried to defend the Jews, the rage of the masses always prevailed. Unfortunately, this anger grew to such an extent that in some cities, like Venice, there were mass killings of Jews. All of this stands as painful evidence of how the fear created by the plague transformed into a tragedy for humanity. However, these unjust accusations against Jews and the mass killings weren't just short-lived bursts of hatred. These events nourished the roots of anti-Semitism that would last for centuries. The anti-Jewish movements during the Black Death laid the foundations for the prejudices, hostilities, and social exclusion against Jews in the years to come. Perhaps in an effort to suppress their own fears, people created scapegoats. But the lives of these scapegoats left behind a dark legacy for future generations. In conclusion, dear listeners, we see that the Black Death was not just a health crisis. It also paved the way for one of the most brutal persecutions in human history. Jews were unfairly targeted amid this disaster because they were one of the most vulnerable groups in European society. And so, in the shadow of the Black Death, humanity once again confronted its dark side. But this story doesn't end here, because the fear created by the Black Death didn't just affect Jewish communities, it also impacted many social and religious groups across Europe. In the next section, we'll explore how this fear spread to other communities and the dark waves that swept across Europe together. Ah, my dear friends, the Black Death didn't just hit humanity with a momentary disaster. Its ripple effects shook the very foundations of Europe for hundreds of years. During that time, it felt like the world had come to a standstill. Time slowed down, and life struggled to find its way under the shadow of death. So what was left behind? After the deaths of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of people, what kind of world did the survivors face? Today I'm going to tell you how the massive population loss caused by the Black Death led to long-term changes in Europe. Yes, friends, the population in Europe had decreased so drastically that cities were empty, fields lay abandoned, and villages had turned into ghost towns. Yet, interestingly, humanity managed to find new paths and opportunities after all this destruction. The devastating impact of the Black Death actually sparked a transformation that had been lurking deep within society. Because this great catastrophe didn't just take lives, it also shook the very foundations of the feudal system. At that time, society was closely tied to the feudal order, which was largely agrarian. Peasants worked the land and lived under the protection of their lords. But in the post-plague era, things would never be the same again. Suddenly, the number of agricultural workers, craftsmen, and servants, the labor force, had decreased so much that those who remained became far more valuable. It was no longer as easy for a lord to find workers. And this is where, dear friends, people found an opportunity: bargaining power. People realized that they could fight not just to survive, but for better conditions, more freedom and higher wages. Workers, peasants, craftsmen, they all suddenly became precious. As landowners struggled to find workers, they had to give in to the demands of the peasants. Those who once worked merely to survive now had bargaining power to determine their own living conditions. So the new world that emerged after the plague offered opportunities not just for those who survived, but also for those who sought a better life. However, this social change didn't stop at the economic level, my friends. There were also profound transformations in the structure of society. That feudal order, with its rigid class distinctions, began to crumble under the brutal blows of the plague. Nobles were no longer as powerful, and the authority of the church was diminished in the eyes of the people, because the plague was a disaster that even religion and the church couldn't prevent. People of that time turned to churches, prayers, and pleas to God for help. But the disease struck everyone, regardless of faith. This initiated a questioning process against the authority of the church in people's minds. Why had God allowed such a disaster? Why couldn't the church protect its people? Dear friends, this shift in mindset laid the groundwork for the following centuries. After the plague, people began to stop leaving their fates solely in the hands of God or the nobility. A spirit of questioning and resistance emerged against the unquestionable authority of the church and the aristocracy. Perhaps one of the greatest outcomes of the Black Death was this: people wanted to take more control over their own lives. This would plant the seeds for the Renaissance, Reformation, and Enlightenment movements that would unfold in Europe later on. But dear listeners, all these structural changes were not without pain. Feudal lords strongly resisted the new demands of the peasants. However, workers and peasants were in a time when finding replacements for their positions was impossible. Revolts, uprisings, social unrest, all of these became part of this era. Although they faced resistance from feudal lords, the church, and other powerful institutions, ultimately this great catastrophe made the transformation of class structures and social order in Europe inevitable. But dear listeners, all these structural changes were not without pain. Feudal lords strongly resisted the new demands of the peasants. However, workers and peasants were in a time when finding replacements for their positions was impossible. Revolts, uprisings, social unrest, all of these became part of this era. Although they faced resistance from feudal lords, the church, and other powerful institutions, ultimately this great catastrophe made the transformation of class structures and social order in Europe inevitable. Friends, here are the long-term consequences of the population decline from the Black Death. The few people who remained after this great tragedy found opportunities they could never have dreamed of before. The distinctions between social classes blurred, individual rights and freedoms gained importance, and the decaying structure of the feudal system began to crack. While the Black Death wiped out millions, it also propelled humanity into a significant transformation process. And so, dear friends, history once again shows us that after great disasters, renewal and transformation always follow. After the devastation caused by the Black Death, Europe left its old order behind and opened the doors to a new era. The foundations of society, the economy, religion, and human thought were shaken, and the echoes of that upheaval continued to be felt for centuries. Ah, friends, don't forget, after every dark period, a light always emerges. People, even in their darkest times, find a way to discover hope and opportunity. The Black Death remains one of the most striking examples of this ancient cycle of humanity. Ah, my dear friends, just when the terrifying effects of the Black Death were starting to fade from memory, Europe found itself shrouded in another dark cloud. People were slowly trying to move on from the devastation they had experienced in the wake of the plague. But unfortunately, the shadow of disaster doesn't lift easily. In the 1360s and 1370s, the Black Death returned to Europe like a ghost, sweeping across the land once more. Think about that time, my friends. Somehow people had managed to survive, cities were starting to come back to life, and fields were being planted again. However, the people of that era believed the disease was completely gone, and they thought they could finally breathe easy. But the Black Death had never truly left. It was lying in wait, like a hunter, ready for the right moment. Then came the second wave in the 1360s. Even though people were somewhat more prepared this time, they found themselves helpless once again when the plague struck. Oh, what a dreadful time it was. The plague re-emerged in many parts of Europe, especially in cities. The towns that had survived the first wave seemed more experienced, but they still faced the same helplessness. The crowded nature of the cities caused the disease to spread quickly once again. The population that had survived the first wave was hit hard by this second wave. Sadly, people were desperate, my friends. They had no idea how to escape this disaster that they saw with their own eyes, or how to protect themselves. This second wave of the plague in the 1360s and 1370s particularly targeted the young population. Yes, my friends, the young people who had survived the first wave now fell prey to this terrible disease. A whole generation was nearly wiped out. The elderly had witnessed the destruction brought by this new wave before, but the young were in greater danger this time. People at that time couldn't understand why the plague was specifically targeting the youth. Perhaps the older individuals, with their weaker immune systems, managed to escape this time, while the young couldn't flee from this calamity. Oh, my friends, the second and third waves of the Black Death shook society to its core once again. The economy faltered, trade routes closed down, and the chilling breath of the plague could be felt in every corner of Europe. People locked themselves inside their homes in fear once more, and cities went into quarantine. Churches filled up again as people sought solace in prayer. But just like in the first wave, neither prayers nor medical interventions were enough to stop this horrific disaster. The plague continued to sweep away everything in its path. The plague waves of the 1360s and 1370s also deeply shook the spirit of society. Just like during the first outbreak, people began searching for someone to blame. Sadly, Jews once again became the target of this tragedy. In their desperation, people declared Jewish communities as scapegoats once more. Historical records describe how many Jewish communities were brutally slaughtered and driven out of towns. This was not only about a disease, but also a re-emergence of the dark side of the human spirit, my friends. However, the return of the Black Death did not just affect people's physical health, it also shook their minds and beliefs. Those who survived the first outbreak might have thought that God had shown them mercy. Yet, the second wave suggested that God's wrath was far from over. The Church's failure to provide solutions for these events weakened the influence of religious authorities over the people once again. New religious movements, sects, and belief systems became more pronounced in Europe after this period. The Church's inability to cope with the outbreak laid the groundwork for new inquiries and religious reform movements. And so, my dear listeners, the return of the Black Death struck Europe once again. But this blow deeply affected not only bodies but also minds and beliefs. People could neither fully hold on to their old beliefs nor find a new path forward. This second wave of disaster was etched in history as an unforgettable period that fundamentally changed not just Europe's physical structure, but also its social and cultural framework. Ah, my dear friends, I want to share with you that the Black Death wasn't just a horrific disaster, it was a turning point that changed the course of world history. It left behind a legacy that signified not just the pain endured, but also the end of the Middle Ages and the dawn of an entirely new world. Think back to those years when the Black Death ravaged all of Europe. For people at that time, the world was filled with darkness, fear, and death. But you know how they say every darkness is followed by light? That's what this terrible plague turned out to be. The oppressive, stagnant, and tradition-bound structure of the Middle Ages began to crumble with the plague. People realized that the old order was no longer sustainable in the face of this horror. Even the church was helpless against this great catastrophe. Even the clergy couldn't escape the plague, feeling once again how harsh God's wrath could be. But it was this helplessness that directed human minds toward new searches. The Black Death was one of the events that brought the Middle Ages to an end and sparked the Renaissance, my dear listeners. People during that time understood they couldn't overcome this horrific disaster with traditional beliefs. Faith in scientific thought, art, human intellect, and creativity began to take root during this period. The devastating effects of that time also laid the groundwork for a great rebirth. It wouldn't be wrong to say that the bright light of the Renaissance was born from the gloomy shadow of the Black Death. The population loss created by the Black Death turned Europe's social and economic structures upside down. There were no peasants left to work the fields, artisans and traders vanished, and cities almost turned into ghost towns. However, this significant drop in population created entirely different opportunities for those who survived. Landowners had to grant workers more rights due to the reduced labor force. Peasants began to work under better conditions, and some even found opportunities to manage their own lands. In a way, the foundations of the feudal system began to shake with this disaster. Seeds were being sown for a new economic order in Europe. But my friends, the legacy of the Black Death left deep marks not only in economic or social realms, but also in the fields of medicine and science. Faced with the horror caused by the plague, people clearly saw the inadequacy of traditional medicine. While up until then, diseases were believed to be a punishment from God, different thoughts began to sprout. Doctors and scientists started searching for the source of the plague and ways to treat it. For the first time, more systematic methods were developed to deal with epidemics. The concept of quarantine was applied. Special places were even built in port cities to quarantine the sick. These practices are now recognized as the foundational steps of modern medicine. And then came the Renaissance, that brilliant period born in the shadow of the Black Death, the golden age of art, literature, and science. People were now expecting more from life. They wanted to learn and create new things. In fact, the gloomy atmosphere created by the plague became one of the most important sources of inspiration for art. Many works created during that time reflected death and human helplessness. But within that despair, there was also a glimmer of hope. Humanity was learning to take lessons from the suffering it endured. The theme of the Dance of Death became one of the most iconic art movements of this period. Painters, sculptors, and writers all began to create works about the inevitability of death. But these works didn't just reflect a disaster, they also reminded us of the value of life. Ah, my dear friends, the Black Death was perhaps one of the most profound disasters in human history. Yet the legacy that followed showed us that behind every catastrophe, there's a new beginning. The illuminating light of the Renaissance heralded a rebirth for humanity. In those years, people, equipped with the lessons learned from the Black Death, laid the foundations for a stronger, more knowledgeable, and more creative society. Modern medicine, science, and art were born in the shadow of those dark days, and we still carry their traces today. The legacy of the Black Death symbolizes the light that emerged from one of the darkest moments in human history, my dear listeners. People learned to embrace life in the shadow of death, and this legacy forever changed the flow of history. Ah, my dear friends, now we're turning the last pages of our story about the Black Death. This tale speaks of a deep legacy that stretches from those grim years filled with death to our world today. The fear, pain, and helplessness experienced during that dark time were brutal lessons for humanity. But as they say, there's always a light that follows darkness, and after the Black Death, humanity emerged stronger and more resilient, having learned from this catastrophe. Just think about it. Back then, doctors, physicians, leaders, nobody knew how to deal with this unseen enemy. The plague was like a hurricane, sweeping away everything in its path. People believed that God was punishing them, trying to stop the disaster with prayers and rituals. But despite all efforts, the initial measures taken against the Black Death were quite primitive and insufficient. However, as time went on, people began to learn lessons from this calamity. The Black Death brought not just death but also a process of learning. Many of the measures we take against epidemics today can trace their roots back to those years' quarantine, isolation, and steps to prevent the spread of infectious diseases all reflect the lessons left behind by the Black Death. Dear listeners, the Black Death didn't just devastate medieval Europe, it also laid the groundwork for the modern health system. The horrors of that time pushed people toward a better understanding of medicine. They realized that diseases weren't just divine punishment, but that they needed to seek solutions through science. After the Black Death, scientists began to investigate the origins of diseases, discover new treatments, and effectively deal with epidemics. Even today, the measures we take against outbreaks are shaped by the painful experiences of that period. The COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 was a modern reflection of the lessons learned from the Black Death. Quarantines, social distancing, hygiene measures, all of these are part of the legacy the Black Death left us. For centuries, the field of medicine, shaped in the shadow of the Black Death, continues to teach humanity how to confront these invisible enemies. But my dear friends, the legacy of the Black Death isn't just limited to medicine. This catastrophe left such deep marks in history that everything from Europe's social structure to its cultural codes was affected by this disease. At that time, the feudal system was nearly on the brink of collapse. The massive population loss led peasants and workers to demand more rights. The people, who once bowed to their lords, the church and kings, began to recognize their own power. A new social order emerged, laying the groundwork for the revolutions that would come in later centuries. The Black Death was not just a disaster, it marked the beginning of a societal awakening. And of course, art, oh dear listeners, art. The gloom, the darkness, the helplessness of humanity in the face of death were deep feelings that artists poured onto their canvases and papers. The theme of the Dance of Death illustrated that fine line between life and death. Artists of the post-plague era taught us what it meant to create in the shadow of death. These somber artworks still live on in museums and literature, reminding us of those dark days of the past. Today, as we look at this legacy, we see that the Black Death shaped not only that era but also our present. Humanity learned lessons from this great disaster, looking into the cold face of death to learn how to survive and build a new world. The Black Death left such a mark on history that it's impossible to erase it. These lessons teach us how to deal not just with diseases, but with life itself. Now, dear friends, as we reach the end of this long journey, I want to remind you once again that the Black Death was not just a disease, it was a turning point for humanity. The pain, losses, and helplessness of those years have all become our teachers today. Just like there's light after every darkness, the Renaissance that followed the Black Death offered us opportunities for renewal, rebirth, and change. And this legacy will continue to stand as one of the brightest lessons born from humanity's darkest days. History, my dear friends, is not just a story of the past. It helps us understand today and tomorrow, guiding us to make the world a better place. The lessons taught by the Black Death are still with us. Thanks to them, we stand strong in every new outbreak and every difficult struggle, fortified by the wisdom of the past. That's why history is our greatest teacher. And in every disaster, there's a new beginning for those who know how to learn from it. Now, as we conclude this long and challenging journey, think once more about the lasting marks the Black Death left on history. Remember, every great disaster is a herald of awakening.